Welcome back, everybody who has been on the previous talk with us as well. And hello to those who are just joining. I would like to introduce our next speaker here. We have Craig Cockburn with us, who is a well-experienced speaker and agilist, who has written books and given so many talks, definitely expert in the matter. And we will be continuing the talk on the roadmaps here, so some continuity with the previous talk. As usual, feel free to submit your questions in the Q&A section. We will try to answer as many as we can in the end. And I'll be monitoring the chat for any real-time things as well. Yes, Craig, floor is yours. Please take it away.
Okay, thank you. And just today, I'm really enjoying the conference so far. Yesterday was fantastic. And I was just catching Roman Pichler there, which what he was saying was very interesting. I've met him, I've seen him speak many times. I'm actually building on Roman Pichler's content in this talk. So you see how that unfolds, but it's great that we're all speaking along with similar lines and similar themes. So this is again connected to roadmaps, and this takes it up to strategy maps, which is a concept I developed to help with visualization and alignment. So my name is Craig Cockburn, and this is a slightly more recent picture than the one that was in the previous slide. I've got a few more grey hairs. Feel free to connect via craigcockburn.com, and my other new site I'm building is Unbiased Agile. So that's all my kind of social media links, and I am actually very distantly related to Alistair Cockburn, one of the Agile Manifesto co-authors. And I work as a freelance Agile coach, and I'm based in Edinburgh, Scotland, and work with a variety of clients. And I've been using Agile now for around about 15 years and been a coach since 2011. But you can read all that online and see more about it there. So basically, the key audience here is pretty much everybody. I try and break some myths and say that strategy is not really just for the C-suite or the top executives. I think that strategy is very much like testing and quality and being customer-centric. Is the more people have insight and contribute, the better perspectives we get, the different perspectives we get. We're breaking down that management silo, that horizontal silo, and we're getting much more inclusive thinking. So really, I just think that strategy is something that's relevant to everybody. And even when you think about sprint planning and Scrum, the sprint plan is your strategy for that sprint in order to achieve the goal. So let's start thinking about strategic approaches at every level of the organization rather than just leaving it for the top people. So just to all of us, as I will explain in this talk. So moving on, this is the format of the talk, about an introduction to strategy and why it matters. I'll talk you through quite a complex worked example that shows that this approach works. And I'll give you a simple template and show how that is used, and then explain some of the supporting practices. So there's quite a bit to cover. There's time at the end for questions, hopefully, and I'll give you some takeaways. And of course, the deck's going to be available. I did send this to the conference organisers yesterday, so that is also available too. And this is the talk in a visual format. So you can see, I introduce it, explain the problem, talk about the solution, how to use it, recap, and then some ongoing learning. And the sizes of these areas correspond roughly to the amount of time I spend on those particular things. This is a visualization format I also use, but I'll run this through as we're doing the talk. So it gives you a chance to kind of recap and see what's been covered in a visual way, but like a Kanban board for a talk. So again, building the Roman Pichler stuff, I've seen him talk. He does a great talk. He talks about strategy, and it's really important, and about that connectedness from top to bottom between what teams are doing and what organizations are doing. But also, I've been to a lot of Simon Wardley's mapping talks, and he talks about visualization, mapping, strategy, and that's all important too. And when I was first working in a team a few years ago, they were saying, yeah, these talks are great, but how do we then take that and start implementing? What does strategy really mean? Or what do we actually do first? And why? How do we relate a Wardley map to what we're now doing first? And how do we kind of connect the two up? So this talk evolved out of that, in which I first took a Wardley map and then built a plan from it, and which teams do what. And then the strategy talk then evolved out of that approach to then yeah, there's a bigger picture to solve here. So first of all, a bit of an introduction to maps. I don't have the time to explain and teach you wardley maps, that's its own talk. But why do maps matter? Well, here's an ancient battle that Simon Wardley refers to, in which, with the traditional management approach on the right of strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, we look at the battle, but it doesn't really help us in terms of what do we do first and why. Whereas the map on the left shows that the one army chooses to block the sea, that then forces the other army to fight on the land, where there is a narrow front. Therefore, that narrow front means that their bigger advantage is then reduced because they're forced to fight in a narrow front at Thermopylae, and therefore their advantage of size is then reduced. So you can see moves in context and what comes first and why. And that's probably a lot more useful than a SWOT chart. Even though the SWOT chart might help drive some discussions, you need to take that and know what to do first. Now that's Simon Wardley's example, and that was from about 2,500 years ago. Rolling forward slightly to the Battle of Bannockburn, which, because I'm Scotland, in Scotland, this is a big deal in our history. It's still referred to, and it's important because kind of like it was the cornerstone of the Scottish independence movement. But actually, what's critical for this talk here is that this was only a 2-day battle. Yet, with effective strategy, the weaker army, the Scots, overcame the stronger army, the English army, who were more than double their size. And it's an example of where strategy can help you to win against your competitors, even when they, on the face of it, have a competitive advantage. And so the strategy for Bannockburn is those 6 steps here. It's about understanding the landscape, taking advantage of that, taking the enemy a bit by surprise, have the high ground, have better line of sight, hem the army in, and then force them onto boggy ground where they just get bogged down, literally. And therefore they then broke ranks, panicked, because fighting there was quite regimented. When they break rank, there's no mobile phones then or anything else. And when there's a lot of smoke, there's a loss of communication too. So in this example, the Scots overcame a superior force using situational movement and the landscape and purpose. And this battle was only 2 days, which again reinforces the fact that strategy is not just for multi-year things. Even a 2-day strategy can still be sung about 700 years later. So that's kind of the intro about a bit about me, Roman Pitcher Wardley, and battles and mapping, and why visualization matters. Now go into the problem of strategy. First of all, we don't always speak with a common language. I've seen organizations invent their own vocabulary, and then when people Google stuff external and look at agile stuff, we're all speaking about different stuff. You know, it's like, yeah, but you need this, and then I've heard about that. And it's like, so you just need to agree the language. So for the purposes of this talk, these are my definitions, and this is what they mean. And importantly, strategy is coherent, it hangs together, there's no magic moments there, and it's context driven, because it's solving the problem that you're facing, and it's to deliver outcomes. So, and these outcomes support the vision that you're trying to move towards. So you've got a vision, and the outcomes are the meaningful things that help that vision to be realized. So you might call that your North Star. And again, you can refer to tactics, which is the way you are approaching this problem, and what are you choosing to do in order to deliver those outcomes. There are other words out there that are used by other people, and you can see like vision might be mission, or it might be objectives, and so on and so on. And also things like OKRs, you can measure the key results and progress, which might validate, are we on the right strategy? So there's a lot of integrated thinking going on here about, people have done this before, but I'm just trying to bring together the language. But what a strategy is not, like that SWOT chart, is a to-do list, because you don't know what to do first. And also cargo cult is simply copying what other people did. Like a lot of people copy Spotify, but hey, you're not a Swedish technical startup. It might work for you, then again, it might not, right? So there's a lot of copying going around. You might get lucky and it might work, but the data doesn't tell us that that actually works very well. So first of all, culture eat strategy for breakfast. Peter Drucker, let's debunk a few myths here. The first one being that he didn't actually say that. There's no evidence at all Peter Drucker ever said such a thing, but it's a bit of a good example of cut and paste, copy it around, it sounds good, let's attribute it to somebody famous. And it's again, this like, just think differently, go back to the source and say what really matters. And for me, they're not competing things. It's not about culture or strategy, it's about both. So they complement one another rather than exclusive. You know, they used to think about alignment and autonomy being two things on the same line, but actually when we see that they're two orthogonal things, you can have both together, but get more out of it. So to me, culture and strategy support one another rather than complement, rather than fight against one another. And you can check the quote investigator at the bottom. So again, it's just like, let's not copy what other people do without context, because that can lead to failure. The bridge in the photo actually is not far from where I live. And it does look a bit ridiculous there in the sea. It looks maybe like an art installation, but actually it's very useful because there's a river under that bridge. So when the tide goes out, you can still cross from the car park to the beach on the other side over the river in the deep channel. But for about a third of the time, when the tide is particularly high, then the bridge looks like it's in the middle of the sea. But for the other 2/3 of the time when the tide's lower, the bridge serves a useful function. What I'm trying to say here is that sometimes things that look useful are useless in the wrong context, and some things that look useless, like the bridge, can be very useful in the right context. So it's about making the right decisions at the right time. And some classic failures here, the Kodaks, the Blockbuster, the Nokias. There's loads of examples. I did a workshop on this topic once. The list was quite lengthy as the examples of failures that people had to come up with. But the reason I mention this is that the businesses that they were in are still around. So we've still got cameras and still watch films. It's just that it's not that the business went away, it's that they got disrupted out of their line of business through a failure of strategy and a failure to see what was really coming. And by the time it was coming, it was a bit too late. I mean, Nokia is still quite a big company. We're just not so aware of it because it's much more back end, but they're only a fraction of what they used to be. And interestingly, from a COVID perspective, Nokia used to make respirators for 60 years. So it's interesting the lines of pivots that different companies have been on, but it's about trying to anticipate the future rather than what the Agile Manifesto says is about responding to change. Well, that's important, but seeing what's coming is also important. And yeah, strategy in other walks of life. I talk a lot about Brexit here, which is the process of Britain catastrophically leaving the EU, which Scotland didn't vote for, but I'll try and keep the politics out of it all. But basically, you know, people decided in 2018, nobody really liked it because what was actually then on the table was not the thing that people voted for. So about changing our minds wasn't really a thing that the politicians wanted to entertain. But some data I'll just flick through this quickly, but 97% of 10,000 executives said strategy was the most important thing. That's from Harvard Business Review in 2019. But the real data, this is from Agility Health Radar and Business Agility Institute report a few years ago. It is the largest challenge. It's not just me saying this. It's if the data out there supports this too. And critically, it also says that it's about motivational leadership and lack of agile mindset and unclear or changing vision. So people don't really know the why, there isn't alignment, leaders aren't leading, right? So that's 2018, let's go forward to 2019. Oh, it's just exactly the same, right? So it's, you see the bottom's changed, it's a different PDF, but it's like nothing changed in a year. In 2020, it's still much the same story. It's still probably much the same story now. It's really, we see a lot of data from lack of leadership and a lack of alignment, legacy styles and legacy behaviors and legacy culture. And I wrote this up based on, you know, speaking to consultants, different things like State of Agile reports, speaking to coaches, looking at newspaper articles. There's a whole series of failure patterns around Agile that means that this is a real problem worth solving. So that's kind of like underlined and given some data behind the problem and some failure examples. But moving on now to what do we do about that? This is me at a PI planning session. You can see it's just a big mess of work. Like, where do you start first? From Scaled Agile Framework, this is a quote. that they use from Geoffrey Moore about, again, executives talking at cross purposes and nobody knows what they mean, which is why I had my own definitions out there for you. And people will just give different answers of what it is of what we're doing. So that's about SAFe and strategy. However, when we look at what SAFe itself says, and this is some quotes about the ability to change and implement strategies, fine, okay, but what do we do? Right. And this is their diagrams. Now that's not really going to solve these types of problems. And it's a line with some cones. Okay, so that's given us all the answers we need, has it not? And the reason that I'm not here to just criticize SAFe, I mentioned SAFe here because in amongst all the agile frameworks and scaling methods, it's the most popular, but also it targets itself as whole organization from top to bottom. And even if SAFe is not talking about strategy effectively, there is a gap. So we need to know more about just continually sensing the market. We need practical things we can practically do to bring about the alignment and talk about our competitors more. So now off to the Roman Pichler link, building on what he says. You've maybe seen this recently. He has this connection between company vision to product strategy in the top, this bit up here. So things line up and the company vision supports the business strategy, which supports the product strategy. So this brings about a certain level of alignment, stuff to do. But in terms of what do the teams do? Well, they work off a product backlog down here on the right. That product backlog is informed by your product roadmap, which is your longer term, a few months to maybe a year sort of thinking. The product roadmap is informed by the product strategy, which is a longer term thing, which helps to realize the vision. So here's the sense of connectedness as to how things line up. And I mean, yeah, that's useful. You can get alignment through that. But how do we do this? So I then loop to what Simon Wardley talks about, the strategy cycle. And in this cycle, you go around from here, which is the why of purpose, to get to the why of movement. So an analogy is like playing chess. First of all, why play chess at all? Why are we in this game? You might want to just up your IQ, you might be competitive, you might like the social aspects. There's a whole lot of why bother. Right? But then when you've chosen to do that thing, the why of movement is related to playing the game. And so then context matters even more because the move that is the best move depends on what way the pieces are laid out when you're making that move. And it's very much context driven. Through this, you look at the landscape, which is things in business landscape, things that don't change so much. Then climate, which is things that affect the landscape, like landscape of Bannockburn is there's a hill. Climate is, well, maybe it's rained the day before and there's a bog, right? So, and there's soft ground. So these things can affect the landscape. And the doctrine is a set of practices and beliefs that Simon Wardley has well documented to explain the sorts of things that are valuable, like address duplication first, because it's waste whatever you're trying to do, understand context and meaning, and there's a whole lot of doctrine practices. And then you decide and exhibit leadership, which we saw was missing before. So that's a strategy cycle. It relates to the Sun Tzu, which is The Art of War. It's a very ancient Chinese book. And also John Boyd's OODA loop. And John Boyd was a fighter pilot in the US military after World War II. And he said, basically, if you can go around this OODA loop, orient, observe, decide, act, that loop quicker than anyone else, to then be in a better position to win an air fight. There's some supporting practices. I won't dwell on this too long, there's a lot of words, but these can help you to map that to the sorts of things you should be doing at different parts. But rather than going into the detail too much, obviously the slides are available and you can refer to this afterwards. But what's often missing is the people aspect or the dynamics of what competitors might do. And remember, culture and strategy are not mutually exclusive. So therefore, let's look about the Agile Manifesto. Half of the values are actually about people. Although it's the manifesto for software, half of them are about how do people collaborate. We often lose sight of that when we just take a framework and implement it. We're all about implementing that framework, and not enough about respecting people, collaborating with people, and figuring out how people can collaborate in better ways, the framework becomes the kind of go-to guide, and we lose sight of the other parts that are so important. And also, when I've seen strategies, they're not often updated in line with feedback and changing circumstances. Typically, a new chief executive would come in, there'd be a new strategy evolved, it would go on a PowerPoint deck, it wouldn't be updated for 5 years. But certainly in the last, well, whatever, 5-10 years in Britain, we've had a change of head of state, several prime ministers, COVID, and now we've got a fuel crisis. You know, you have to be reflective of real world circumstances and not just assume that the old world works. And do it in line where you think it needs to be updated, but update it in line with changing events, because then different things become important. Quick touch on to psychology as well, because when we expect leaders to make decisions, they need enough knowledge to make that decision. They need to be confident that they're doing what they're doing. And this is really a way of looking at knowledge and acquisition, is that out there, knowledge is evolving, or it's emerging, or it's existing. And therefore, knowledge then becomes like unknown or known to us, and then becomes familiar to us from unfamiliar. So there's a process of knowledge acquisition and processing to consolidate that in order then that we can then act effectively. So let's not assume a fixed strategy, because everybody's at different levels of understanding. So even if it's obvious to one person, that knowledge needs to be socialized in order that you've got buy-in for collective agreement. Hence, transparency matters. So I'll talk you through Brexit without too much of the political ins and outs, because it was messy. And I'll just show you that even though it was messy, we could actually still predict what was going to happen. And this is the inspiration for this talk, which was shown via flowcharts, which I then took and made a simpler template from. Why bother with Brexit? Well, don't ask me, because I don't really know. But yeah, there's simply somebody had a motive as to why it was a good idea. But understanding that then helps you to kind of rationalize what's going on or what somebody might be trying to achieve, so that you can then seek to undermine them if you don't want that outcome. Landscape was the things that we were working with, and a few years ago, remember pre-Brexit, like 3 years ago, there was competing groups, Parliament was fractured, there's no clear majority, there was lots of stuff to work with, but you just had to work with that because that's the way things were. But there was also climatic factors, there was things that was changing. So there was time limits set by the EU, the government lost its majority, there was legal action in the Supreme Court that actually changed the fact that Parliament couldn't be prorogued, it had to be brought back. There was a lot of propaganda and misinformation, and therefore this altered the dynamic somewhat. And again, it's useful to pay attention to that, to see where that dynamic can then play out. And so somebody called John Worth documented all these about what would happen next, and there's a vast amount of political detail in there, but nonetheless it shows the level of complexity that was going on. But at the bottom, interestingly, he painted what he saw as being 7 prospective outcomes. I meant, oh, that's interesting, because at the top he viewed the types of Brexit that would happen, and vertically he had timescales. This is a 2-dimensional flowchart related to outcomes and time, and it shows plausible pathways and which things might diverge, things might converge, and approximate likelihoods. So despite the complexity of a situation that was changing on an almost daily basis, he could still forecast and say, yes, on April 2019, he actually forecast that a general election was the most likely thing that would happen next, and he was correct. So despite the high dynamics and high fluidity and high contention, you know, he was actually correct in predicting what would happen as the next important stage. Now, the thing is that this level of analysis was completely absent. You would see political interviews and it would just be, I want this, but with no plan. It was just all about what people want. And it's a bit like stakeholders in business. I want this. Yes, but how? There was no real plan. So to take this, you could then work backwards to say, but what is the plan? So all I did was turn the map on the left. This is his map, so it's a bit rough and ready here. But I said, oh, let's put that on the left and turn it around to make it more like a timeline. And then look at the outcomes you're trying to achieve and how you would achieve them. But importantly, also, you need to see the outcomes your opponents are trying to achieve, so that even if you don't get what you want, you should be undermining what your opponent wants. And this is often the thing that's completely absent in business strategy. It's not just, yes, we want this, we want more sales, but how do you actually then undermine actively what your opponents are trying to do to stop them, putting you out of business? And that discussion about self-inflicted wounds or what the competition is genuinely doing then drives what you need to do and also why you need to do it. Simon Sinek talks about this in The Infinite Game. It's about staying in business. You might not always succeed every time, but if you avoid the worst outcomes, you will still be in business to fight another day. And I mentioned red team thinking here because some of the practices I do relate to that about avoiding worst outcomes builds on the work of the pre-mortem technique by Dr. Gary Klein, where he talks about imagine a failure state and then work backwards from that and then see how far along that path you really are to make that transparent. So this is the way with that diagram to build a context-specific flexible strategy, which both looks ahead and is reactive. And it's about this capability to look ahead proactively that I think is the key that's often missing. Because with that on its side, I could say, well, these are the outcomes here, right? So I made that clear. And then I could say, well, if you did want one of these good outcomes, the green ones, you then work backwards to say, what's the plan, right? And there's actually two here. You go get an extension, or do this, right? And was more risky, but you can now see how the plan relates to the outcome, and you can also then start having conversations around avoiding the worst outcomes. I think that it ended up with probably a black one or a grey one, but you can't control everything, and I'm not in charge of the political map. So, but this is having an open and frank conversation about, is this likely to work, and what do we need to do to change it? But try and step a little bit away from the politics of it all. The idea is to have the outcomes you want being your roadmap, but also, is it taking you in the right direction? And what are your opponents trying to do? When are they trying to do them? And also, when should you update this? Those Brexit diagrams are updated regularly in line with something that had changed. That's the time when you then reflect and say, is the strategy working or not? Other than just plough on regardless, which is what some of the parties did, and then they failed. And the Labour Party lost its leader, and the Lib Dems lost their leader because they had a poor strategy and believed in wishful thinking, which wasn't a very good strategy. So evaluation of how this complicated, sophisticated mess all worked. And, the first series had Brexit Delay, which is what we got, and then there's the general election, which I mentioned, and then Johnson's deal. So it was actually accurate at predicting in a complex world. And who wouldn't want that in business? Right? Who wouldn't want the ability to at least see that little bit clearer than everyone else? This isn't a silver bullet, but it does give you extra insight and extra capability to look ahead. But just seeing that a little bit further, a little bit clearer than everyone else, a slightly better view of the future. And guide ourselves by facts and opinions. And even if we're covering an inconvenient truth, let's uncover that and let's discuss it rather than hiding. So that's the work through of the very complex Brexit inspiration. And I take this to a simpler worked example that's more relevant to Agile, applying this approach in real life in your teams. So I took that left to right approach, that's the timeline at the bottom of this diagram, and I took the competitive advantage approach on the left. So you can start to see advantage against time. Now this bit in the middle, just have that blank when you're using it as a map. I've filled that in there to show you what goes on here. But the thing on the left here is describe the situational context. So what are the problems you are actually facing right now that you want to solve and why? Make that visible. What's your vision that you're trying to achieve in the far right-hand corner? What are you trying to get to? and what are the favourable outcomes that would then support that. Importantly, also talk about the unfavourable outcomes, because we always want to discuss what the competitor might do, and that's often absent, and their vision. So you're actually playing it a bit like a wargaming type situation of the opponents might do this, so we need to do that. And then this where I've annotated with a bit of description. At the middle of this, think of it like a football pitch, right? So this is just in the middle of the pitch. This is playing in your opponent's half, tactical advantage. So it's good, it's useful. If you watch sport, you see a lot of analysis of stats, of who's got possession or where the ball's landed, and if it's tennis or whatever. That's tactical advantage, and that's a good indicator, but it doesn't win you the game. Winning the game is embedded gains, which is like scoring a goal. So that's like product delivery. Tactical advantage is things like internal work, safe calls them enablers, useful, but the customer doesn't care. Right? The customer cares about when you deliver the product and they get it, and the advantages support that. But the disadvantage of embedded gains or delivering a product is like the iPhone. Apple launched it, fantastic, loads of money, changed the industry, but now everybody knows what it is and they can copy you. So the tactical advantages are often secret, but the embedded gains that actually move the dial are liable to be copied. And when that happens, the landscape changes, and therefore you need to update your strategy because you don't know yet what your opponents will do in response. So this is about making different levels of strategy visible, because advantage is non-linear. So embedded gains are different to tactical advantages, but you do need to do perhaps both and make it clear what you're doing to support your gains. And so how this works is you start in the here and now, down here in a position of disadvantage you want to solve, and you want to move into the future in a position of favourable gains that then support the vision. So largely the intent of movement is in this direction. But it's not always going to be a smooth path, which we'll see. So this is a conventional roadmap. It's got some stages. It's a bit of a line. There's no options. There's not much in the way of risk. It's all just going to work. We just take the roadmap and do it, right? So this is a roadmap of an organisation wanting to be more agile, and from an HR point of view, they had some old job roles like project manager. They wanted to roll out new roles like product owner and scrum master. They were all rolled out, and then HR would have then transformed the company. That was their roadmap. It's quite a stepwise thing. But what could go wrong with a roadmap like this? Well, that's what they thought would happen. So I mapped this onto here. That's some more job roles that are in a position of disadvantage. They would start to roll them out. So that would be a bit of an internal advantage. When they got all rolled out and people using them, that was their embedded outcome, and hence it'd be transformed. Make this visible and you go, well, okay, that's fine, but actually what could go wrong? Well, that's what went wrong. That's actually what went wrong because it was there at the time. The roles were rolled out, they weren't communicated, people thought their jobs were going away, people didn't know how many people get laid off, people had just done their annual reviews and set their annual goals, and then they were all up in the air. So fear and distrust set in, and often as we see in agile transformations, the frozen middle of management is one of the problems, is that upper management might get it, the people doing the work and scrum teams might get it, but middle management is often at risk of losing its job. So you've got to go, well, that's just going to make things go slower because people will see, well, what's the point? And then when you do that enough, you get entrenched resistance, which is even harder to change, and failure, and that sort of corporate malaise of, oh, this isn't going to work, might encourage good people to leave. Right? So you don't want any of that, but you want to talk about it. So the more realistic approach, and obviously my graphics aren't the best, but this is a bit more like the real reality of, yeah, maybe get a pilot group, do an experiment, expand that. You can see like what's going on. There's optionality now. And this is a reflection of complex work. It's things might work, they might not, we don't know, we can't predict, but we want to constantly evaluate and try different things. And yeah, failure is still on the board, right? But how this relates to what we're doing is that, well, that's your initial roadmap. It's the bit in green. But you've also got a plan B, that's the stuff in yellow. So you're actually preparing and deciding how many plans you need. Do you need the plan B ready just in case? Do you need multiple plans simultaneously, which is perfectly valid? We had this in COVID because we had multiple companies developing multiple vaccines simultaneously, because that made sense rather than waiting for one or two. This is like high parallelism is valuable here because it's highly complex, and the value of that and options is incredibly important. So understanding how many plans you're trying to run at the same time, if it's more than one, how many and why, or even at least preparing the plan is probably a step forward rather than having to respond to a crisis. So there's lots of underlying practices for this about clearly understanding the present, and the supporting things that I talked about. I've mentioned pre-mortem by Dr. Gary Klein, which is a way of resetting psychologically how we think about a problem in order to then explore failure scenarios more clearly. Use of cynefin, because often Agile is in the complex space. Sometimes it's complicated, so therefore not so much needed there for planning. It's just understanding what to do. But the further in the complex space we are, the further things might diverge from what we expect, and the quicker we need to sense and respond. And yeah, OKRs can help here, because the OKRs can then measure, are we doing what we are doing in line with where we expect to be? Are the results adding up? Or are they indicating more readily, but on a failure path? But the overall principle here is simply about open and effective collaboration. So as I say about cynefin, is useful here because cynefin can guide us to an appropriate level of planning, an appropriate level of experimentation, an appropriate level of sensing and responding, depending on the situation we find ourselves in. So this is just an annotation of cynefin, which typically Agile is more in this space. COVID was probably over here in super complex. Scrum is typically in the green area. Some things are just complicated because they've done it before, like building the pipeline for deployment. So it's about the right approach to the right problem and making that transparent rather than assuming, like many strategies, everything is predictive. So you could use cynefin to color the domains and make them more visible if you thought that would help you. Strategy maps have been referenced before. This is from an emeritus professor at Harvard. He talked about them 20 years ago, but it's much more based on the balanced scorecard approach, which is really just about balancing metrics. We've moved on from then, and Agile was kind of in its infancy as well, but it doesn't actually talk about ordering or complexity or the why of movement, and therefore difficult to make it into a real plan that makes sense. It's also very PowerPoint friendly, so I guess maybe executives like that, but it's not quite so relevant now to collaborative working because PowerPoint's generally read-only, and we want mediums and feedback mechanisms that really work. So, and again, I've mentioned it, I'm thinking a couple of times, because this is a well-established and well-used and proven set of practices. And it's also being referenced as well by Mike Cohn, leader in the Agile space. He talks about it in a blog a couple of years ago. And there's a whole suite of practices, you know, despite being in the military, this is all in the open. It's all free. You can just Google it and search for it. And they have a tactic called String of Pearls, which is about bringing order, bringing out the second order effects of not just doing something, but then saying, well, if we were to do that, what could then result? And there's workshops and there's practices and there's facilitation that can help to guide those sorts of conversations. But it's all free. You can just download that through the link. But let's look at really what makes a good effective roadmap and building, and what Roman's been talking about. That's from Comic Agile about, well, I hope that our Agile release train that doesn't turn, that the market requires us to turn, because trains aren't all that agile. So maybe let's not do that. And Agile release trains are really about releasing on demand rather than about forecasting exactly what will happen and when. And this is a really good viral tweet that I saw. I mean, it's had like, wow, 6,000 odd likes when I copied it a few years ago, saying that actually what we often talk about is roadmaps, this linear format. Honest roadmaps are a little bit more like forecasting a hurricane that Dan Vacanti talks about. And a strategic roadmap is very much what I'm talking about here. And this is 2020. I've been talking about this sort of format now for 3 years prior to this. Pavel's got better graphics than me and is a bit more Twitter friendly, but that's the sort of thinking that makes it a more honest conversation. And yeah, that's pretty viral for an Agile tweet about roadmaps. So that's basically how to use it, and some earlier maps and a few bits and pieces. So just bring that up for your info as to where we're going in the talk. Now, just a quick look back to wardley maps. Well, what they do, if you go and search, there's tons of free content out there, and they visualize movement in relation to technical maturity and value stream. So value stream is the thing that's visible, and technical maturity is things going from like bespoke products to services to utility, which is the product life cycle. And that matters because that happens. But in order to map that out and see what's going on, for which a wardley map is very useful, you then need to go, well, that's what's happening. This is where we should move. But what do we do first? What will we do? What will our competitors do? So this builds on wardley maps, and they work quite well together. And I'm not just talking about technical maturity, it's a more generic concept. So see this really just being like a generic way of visualizing what could happen. A bit like those Brexit maps, by bringing it out, by bringing it in the open, and by having and inviting feedback, we could then evolve it. And it's just a way of making work more visible. So Kanban boards are a way of making work visible. There's lots of techniques we use in Agile to make work visible. And this is just this practice that I think is a good visualization practice for strategy. And earlier related some of the underpinning work that you can use to drive the conversations. And a bit of a diagram here, Celtic knot here, showing that these things all relate. Right? First of all, leadership up here, often absent. What's the vision? What's the outcomes? How do we support people effectively? How do we actually support the right culture to support innovation? Down here, we've got agility, which is responding to complexity and looking ahead. About things like collaborate, deliver, reflect, improve, the simple things of heart of Agile. Moving away from framework-based approaches and focusing much more about the people collaborating better. And then there's also lean, which we do use, Kanban and eliminating waste is important. It's a related and supportive practice to be used as needed. And then underpinning out the circle is the kind of the people that connect all parts of this. So there's different ways to think about this, all connecting together rather than a silo. Some underpinning things you can do, just to remember to avoid the to-do lists, make it open, invite feedback, make it visible, get everybody to understand it. And again, you can use this at different levels. So as I say, you can have strategy for a sprint plan, but you can have strategy for the next couple of years or your org, but it's about trying to make things more visible. I've given you a simple example here, but with a bigger board, a bit like a plan, you can probably put more on it, make it smaller, and maybe put it on a mural or a Miro board. So everybody's out there and seeing what's going on and whether there's like excessive optimism there, like Kodak thinking it's excessive optimism that people will just still want to buy camera film. Well, no, that's excessive optimism and it led to your failure. So you can see the leaps from, I've just got an idea, yeah, we've banked the win there, but that's making excessive optimism readily visible. So just to kind of summarize, there's lots of ways of doing strategy at the minute, but I think that making it visible and visual has a number of advantages. So even if not all of these apply to you, even if some of them apply to you, they could be useful to you. There you go. So there's a list of 12. Context of why, making it visible so people can see it, seeing tactical goals and the supporting work, visualizing the fact you may need multiple routes to achieve your success in plan Bs, visualizing complexity, which is where things may take multiple courses and you're making that readily available as a conversation. Also what your opponents might do. There's lots of things here about the conversations that we need to have and aren't having as much or at all in order to actually get people genuinely bought in to the why. Simon Sinek talks about the why. When you explain the why and get people bought into the why, they're really commit to that in a far more readily way than being handed the work. So that's the kind of recap. about key steps, plus points, and then just kind of wrap up in the ongoing section. Here's a couple of books. So there's Roman Pichler again, he's a great guy. So you'll buy his books and some other links for reading. This is linked to my article. The product delivery mapping was an earlier version, which I said I took a wardley map and made a product roadmap from that, and it's product strategy. All these other things. Declaration of Interdependence is Alistair Cockburn's work just after the Agile Manifesto, in which he said it was very much about people. So that's the kind of further reading. Now time for questions. And there's the talk to remind you.
Thank you very much, Craig. Unfortunately, we are slightly over time. We do not have remaining time for questions. So what I would recommend, folks, Craig is on our WOVA platform. Feel free to head to our community platform and start a thread about visualizing your strategies and continue the conversation. It will be open today and further on after the conference. Thank you once again, Craig. Thank you for being here with us. We're super happy to have you and to have a chance to hear from you. I have shared the link to menti.com for all the participants. Please share your feedback about this talk. I'm sure both us and the speaker will be very interested in learning about that a little bit more.
Yeah. So I'll be on Hoover, so anybody wants to talk to me afterwards, please do.
Absolutely. Thanks again. Much appreciated.
Thank you.